Yes, thanks once more for joining me here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we continue to feature more of those old school dirt bikes from back in the day. Now, just before we get down to our next video posting, a quick shout out to all of the Facebook groups that allow me to post my videos on their pages. Now, there are quite a few, and we will be giving a few of them a mention as the weeks and months progress, but one particular site that I'm quite friendly with is Philip Jobs' Pumping Strokes Facebook page, and if you're into your old classic dirt bikes, then Philip's Pumping Strokes Facebook page is another good place to take a look at these old school vintage dirt bikes. So thanks again to all of the Facebook pages who allow me to post my content on their sites. Okay, let's get down to our next video posting. Now, this next video is the first in a series of brand new videos that we'll be posting about the German Maicos, and this particular video here is episode 1. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into that video and take a look at our first example. And so in this brand new series of video clips, we're going to take a look at various examples of the German Maico motocross bikes, because down the years, Maico have certainly had a huge impact in the sport, especially during those golden years of the 1970s and early 80s. So first up, we're going to take a look at a couple of machines belonging to Eddie Long from Northern Ireland, and these two bikes here are Eddie's 1978 400 Magnum and his lovely 1981 250. And so this first bike of Eddie's is, I think, a 400 or possibly a 440 Magnum from around 1978. Not again a fully original machine from that year, but as I've said before, there are very few of these old German Maicos now stock these days, because you have to remember that many of these old Maicos, or Maicos as you refer to them over there in the States, are now quite old machines, and in this example here it's already heading for almost 45 years old. But despite their aging years, these old German racers are still very highly competitive on the vintage and twin shock racing circuits around the UK. And as I just mentioned, Eddie's bike here is not a fully original machine, because at first glance it appears to have had a replacement exhaust system and a new set of wheels and upgraded rear shocks added, but that's just par for the course of keeping these old bikes out there on the track. Although without doubt the chassis on these old 78 bikes was superb for its day. Okay, it didn't come up to the standard of the 1981 490 Mega 2, but for sure, if you couldn't lay your hands on a decent 81 490, then these 78s or even the 1979 models were still a very good alternative, because they both had excellent handling characteristics and without doubt were a very good replacement for that bigger Mega 2. But again, the motor that was in these old German bikes was first class, and it certainly looks like it's a piston port, possibly a 400 or maybe even a 440 power plant that's inside this bike of Eddie's. An engine, of course, that I'm very familiar with, as I did have the self-same power plant in my old 1980 bike that I raced back in the day. But this engine, of course, wasn't as violent or scary as its bigger brother, the 490, but it was a really sweet motor with a good spread of power and lots of it. But nevertheless, this engine was still perfectly suited to sit inside this tubular steel lightweight chassis. And as I said, if a 490 is too much bike for your needs, and if you can't get your hands on a decent example, then try one of these 78 or 79 Maicos, because they're a perfect club racer's bike with a great engine and a good handling chassis. And so as we move on to Eddie's second machine, and this is his 1981 250 Mega 2, the baby brother to the mighty 490. And once again, this is a perfect example of a good twin shock club rider's bike, because these 250s also had a superb engine and an identical chassis to the big 490. And I have to say that Eddie's 81 250 here still looks like it has all of its stock parts from that year, which is quite rare for these modern times. But basically these 81 250s did have all of the same good handling characteristics of the bigger 490, but with the smaller and less powerful engine. But once more, this reed valve two-stroke motor is an engine that I do know quite well, as I also had a similar bike to Eddie's back in the day, but it had the 250 engine inside a 1980 chassis, which I'm sure you know was a pretty awful handling frame, but thankfully Maico got all of their calculations spot on the year after when they designed this 1981 chassis. Although for your average club rider who just wants a bit of twin shock racing fun at the weekend, then these 81 250s come highly recommended. That's of course as long as you're not one of those power mad Maico junkies, in which case you'd probably best get yourself a bigger 490 rocket ship and scare yourself shitless as you crack open that throttle. But as I said, these 81 250s still had a very good set of suspension on the front and at the back of the bike, but Eddie's seems to have swapped his old Corti Cosa rear shocks for a decent pair of Swedish Öhlins, which of course are a major improvement on those old Corti originals. Still a nice pair of Maicos there to get us underway with this episode 1 of Mega Maicos. That's a couple of lovely machines belonging to Eddie Long, and I've already had the privilege of seeing both of these bikes in action on the racetrack, and as you'd expect, both of them are super quick in their respective classes. And so next up, another different kind of German Maico machine, and this example here is Raymond Thompson's 500, which I'm sure was a bike that was originally built by Maico only here in the UK, just prior to their demise. Of course, nothing stock or original about Raymond's machine, as Maico only was certainly renowned for putting their own spin on these German bikes, and most of them were usually all blinged up with chrome expansion chambers and the like. But nevertheless, this is still a very nice looking machine, decked out in these unusual Scottish rampant lion graphics. But this time though, a 500 twin shocker, probably a 1982 or maybe even a 1983 bike, and as you can see, gone are the old troublesome primary chains with a much more reliable gear-driven crank and clutch. And this time a big reed valve motor, not the older piston port engine, with all of the usual Maico only refinements, with that black alloy ignition cover, the alloy rear brake pedal, and of course the alloy sprocket guard there as well. And I'm pretty sure there's a few race base parts also on this bike with these extra wide race base foot pegs instead of the stock skinny items that Maico bolted onto these frames. Now at the back of Raymond's bike, it's a pair of Dutch-made Riger piggyback shocks, which I've heard have quite a good reputation for their quality and operation, and these will still be miles better than the stock suspension units that Maico bolted onto these bikes back in the day. Now once more, the front and rear hubs on Raymond's Maico are still the alloy Maico originals, although the familiar ribs that are normally on these parts have now been machined off, and then the alloy all nicely polished up, probably to add a bit more bling to the bike, which, as I said, was a Maico only trademark. But for me, fitting black wheel rims to an old twin shocker is a no-no, and a nice clean alloy or gold wheel is certainly the way to go. But as I keep saying, there's so much that you can do to these old German Maicos to personalise them to your own particular taste, because there are a few companies now making remanufactured parts and upgrades for these machines, and Raymond's example here is just one such case, with these Maico parts being supplied by Racebase here in the UK. And basically, if you can think it up, then somebody will probably supply the product, just like these Mad Max Maico Rampant Lion graphics that are stuck here on the fuel tank. But still, without doubt, a different kind of 500 twin shocker, but nevertheless, still a cracking looking and very quick machine. That's Raymond Thompson's Rampant Lion Scottish twin shock Maico 500. And so moving on to our next example of these German Maicos is Kevin Smith's 1983 250 Spider, and once more one of the more elusive models from the German factory, and at a time when of course Maico had ditched their tried and tested old twin shock rear suspension and went on to fit this new design of a single monoshock at the back. Now, although Kevin does have a couple of non-original parts on his bike, this is about as near as you can get to a stock example of one of these Spiders. And what's more, this bike here is still regularly used at classic and vintage scrambles events, although it's not exactly clear why Maico called these 1983 bikes the Spiders, as it never really had any connection to what the bike did or its purpose, but I suppose they had to name it something to distinguish it from the Mega 2s and the Alpha 1s that had gone before. So onto the 83's motor, which again was a reed valve induction two-stroker that, as I remember, had a bore of 67mm and a stroke of around 70mm. And by all accounts, this was another decent power plant that had a 5-speed gearbox. And again, the clutch this time was driven off a gear that meshed straight onto that crankshaft. But the barrel and the head were certainly a different design from the big radial fins of the larger 490s, and it was usually an offset 38mm Bing carburetor that supplied it with its fuel. But for a smaller 250, this engine was still quite powerful for its day, but maybe not just as quick as its equivalent Japanese bikes of its time. And also for 1983, it was a single monoshock rear suspension system that was fitted onto our Spider that carried its remote gas and oil reservoir at the front of the bike's chassis, just like the YZ Yamahas of its day. And this rear shock was also connected to Maico's dual control swing arm, so called because the shock had a lever mounted on the bottom of the shock body, which operated a second lever fixed onto the front of the swing arm, so hence the title dual control. But because most other manufacturers of this period also had names for their rear suspension systems, I expect that Maico didn't want to be left out, and they had to come up with an appropriate title for their swing arm suspension system. Surprisingly though, for 1983, Maico were still sticking with their tried and tested old school drum brakes here at the front, when many other manufacturers had already started upgrading to the more modern hydraulic disc brakes. But a plastic fuel tank for that year, because it was 1980 when Maico switched from those much better looking alloy tanks on the 78 and 79 bikes to these much cheaper and easier to produce plastic items. Although I have to say that there's not too many of these 250s, or even the much bigger 490 Spiders still taking to the racetracks these days, because although their engines were both decent enough, the handling on these bikes wasn't that great, and certainly not in the same league as the iconic 490 Mega 2 twin shocker from 1981, which is still regarded as one of the best open class twin shock motocrossers ever made. But even so, this bike here of Kevin's is still a very nice example of one of these 250 Spiders, which not only looks great, but it is still in regular use each weekend. And as I said, these Spiders may have had a bit of a dubious reputation for their handling and rear suspension systems, but there's certainly no mistaking the fact that they still had their looks. And so, just to finish off this episode 1 of our new Mega Maicos series, we're going to take a look at Peter Williamson's very nice 1981-82 490 twin shocker. Now again, this is not your original Mega 2 from 81, as Peter's bike here has a combination of parts taken from both the 1981 and 82 490s, but nevertheless it's still another cracking looking rendition of one of these iconic German Maicos. So at the front end of Peter's machine he still has the stock 490 front forks, which to be fair in that year were still very good suspension systems that performed very well on the track, even straight out of the crate without any major adjustments or other upgrades. But for sure this Maico fuel tank's certainly not stock, and I'm pretty sure that this is a custom made fuel cell with that extra capacity there just behind the cylinder head. And again, I expect that the 1982 part of Peter's bike will be in reference to this Maico engine as I'm pretty sure that the chassis is still a standard 1981 item, but if you're eagle-eyed, you may have already noticed that this 82 motor has a hydraulic clutch conversion done in it, rather than having the stock cable operated original. And as in our previous 250 bike, this 490 is essentially the bigger brother of that machine, but this power plant was still a pretty awesome piece of kit, and it could certainly pack a punch, and developing raw power and loads of it was never an issue for these open class two-stroke Maico motors. But as you can see again, the original alloy brake backplate has also been changed on Peter's bike for this replacement gold anodized part, which I'm pretty sure are supplied by Bill Brown at Wolfsport. And another Wolfsport part here with this replacement gold alloy rear brake backplate, and that heavy duty alloy rear swing arm is also a substitute for the original Maico steel swing arm, although many riders still prefer to use the original steel items, as these alloy replacements, although much lighter, often suffered from cracks in the alloy if the bike was worked hard over very bumpy ground. But no matter what kind of events you attend, whether it be a classic, vintage or twin shock race meeting, you'll always find a wide and varied selection of these Maico machines littering the racing paddocks, because these old classics are still as popular today as they've always been. And when you think that this example here is not original, it still has its roots set in 1981 and is currently heading for a 42-year-old design. But then that's all down to the Maico engineers who brought us the old AW Maicos of the 1970s to these super quick and great handling models of the early 1980s. But these few examples that we've been looking at here are just a small selection of the many different makes and models that we're going to cover in future episodes of Mega Maico, so make sure that you stay tuned and return for episode 2. And coming up next year on Classic Dirt Bike TV, we check out Martin Reed's lovely 1980 Yamaha YZ 250G. So make sure that you retune. And until the next time, thanks for watching, and it's goodbye for now.